On an Easter morning, when church bells rang with joy, one laundress led the master's children to the river, and none of them returned. What drove her? Madness, faith, or vengeance? This isn't just history. It's a haunting question that lingers. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story from history's shadows. And tell me, was this cleansing or a curse? The story begins in a world divided by color, class, and power, a world where freedom was reserved for some, and bondage was the reality for others. It was the mid-1800s, and the American South was a place of contradictions. Grand plantation homes rose from the earth like monuments to wealth, their white columns gleaming in the sun, while just beyond them fields stretched endlessly tended by men, women, and children whose lives were bought and sold. Easter Sunday was one of the rare days that seemed to unify the community, at least on the surface. Bells rang from small wooden churches, summoning white families in their best clothing, while enslaved people were often allowed a brief reprieve from labor to gather under open skies, praying for redemption, for freedom, for relief. Easter carried layers of meaning. For the masters, it was celebration and ritual. For the enslaved, it was a reminder of suffering, but also of hope, the story of resurrection promising that one day, even their lives might rise beyond the chains of earth. In this world, the laundress lived. She was not a house servant in the traditional sense, not someone who served meals or dressed the mistress for church. Her domain was water, soap, and cloth. Day after day, she bent her back over basins, scrubbing until her knuckles cracked, boiling linens until steam burned her skin, carrying baskets heavier than most men would ever lift. The river or the wash site became her constant companion, the place where sweat and silence met, and yet she was always within reach of the master's children. For laundry was not just cloth, it was their tiny garments, their Sunday dresses, their night clothes damp with sleep. She was a caretaker of sorts, though not by choice. She knew their habits, their laughter, their innocent demands. To them, she may have been just another figure in the household, a pair of capable hands who never refused them. To her, they were reminders of what she had lost, of what slavery had taken, of the cruel truth that she could cradle another woman's child, but never her own. On this plantation, children were symbols of wealth for the master, symbols of innocence for the world outside, and symbols of despair for those who raised them in shadows. The laundress bore these symbols daily. Perhaps she smiled at them. Perhaps she sang to them. Perhaps she dared not feel anything at all. But on Easter Sunday, the lines between duty and desperation would blur as the community rose that morning. Brushing dust from bonnets and straightening collars, the laundress was at her work as usual. Her labor, unnoticed, set the stage for what would unfold. The children, dressed in their cleanest clothes, would follow her steps as they always had. No one knew that this Easter would be remembered not for sermons of joy, but for screams swallowed by the water. The South was full of stories in those years, stories of power, cruelty, faith, and resistance. But this story would be unlike any other. On that Easter Sunday, beneath the ringing of church bells and the promise of salvation, one laundress carried not just baskets of clothes, but a weight that would soon sink beneath the river forever. The laundress was not a figure of luxury, nor of importance in the household. She was invisible, and yet indispensable. Each day began before sunrise, when the rooster had barely crowed and the sky was still a bruised shade of gray. Her work never paused for Sabbath or holiday. Laundry waited for no man. She carried loads of linen and garments to the wash site, sometimes a steaming copper tub near the quarters, often the river itself. The river became her mirror, her confessor, her burden bearer. Laundry was more than just soap and water. It meant breaking her back over boiling cauldrons, wringing heavy cloth until her hands bled. It meant inhaling the stench of sweat, sickness, and filth until it clung to her own skin. She scrubbed it until her knuckles swelled and her nails cracked, and still the piles seemed endless. For the master's family, her work was invisible. They noticed only the crisp whiteness of their shirts, the softness of their bedsheets. They never thought of the woman who made them so. For the laundress, every garment carried a story. The master's shirt, smelling faintly of tobacco and sweat. The mistress's dresses, delicate fabrics that reminded her of her own poverty. And the children's clothes, small nightgowns, stockings, play-worn trousers. To wash these was to touch their lives without ever belonging to them. She could cradle their clothes, but never their hearts. The burden was not just physical. It was spiritual, emotional, unrelenting. Slavery robbed her not only of freedom, but of family. Perhaps she had children of her own sold away at auction, their cries silenced by distance. Or perhaps she had none, denied even the chance to raise her own flesh. Either way, she was forced into a cruel intimacy, tending to the garments and needs of children who lived in comfort. While her womb was either empty or her arms left aching. This injustice festered like an open wound. She sang hymns while she worked, songs whispered from one enslaved mouth to another, songs of deliverance, of Jordan's river, on a land where suffering ended. To the white ears listening from porches, they were harmless spirituals. But to her, they were coded prayers pleas for justice, for release, for cleansing. The laundress's faith was shaped by the world around her. She had been told by preachers that she was born into sin, that obedience was her only path to grace. She had heard the words of baptism, that water washes the soul clean, that drowning in Christ was rising again in purity. Those words took root in her mind, tangled with her grief, her rage, her despair. Water, she came to believe, was more than her workplace. It was power. It could wash away dirt, but also sin. It could cleanse. It could destroy. And so, while she worked, the thought may have taken shape. Each load she carried, each shirt she scrubbed, each child's garment she pressed, perhaps it all whispered to her that water held the answer, that beneath the surface of the river lay not only silence, but absolution. For years she bore this weight in silence, her back bent, her hands raw, her voice hushed. But a burden carried too long can break even the strongest body. And the laundress was breaking, not only from labor, but from the torment of watching the master's children thrive in a world that had taken everything from her to outsiders. She appeared steady, reliable. To the family, she was simply the laundress, nothing more. But inside her, storm clouds gathered. Her labor was no longer just washing clothes. It became the ritual of a woman wrestling with unbearable grief, repressed rage, and a growing conviction that only water could make the world right again. By Easter Sunday, her silence would no longer hold. Easter morning dawned with promise. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of wildflowers that pushed up through the thawing earth. Birds sang from the branches, their melodies mingling with the distant toll of church bells calling families to worship. For many on the plantation, this was one of the rare days when beauty and suffering seemed to collide, a day of joy for some, of longing for others. The master's family awoke early, as was tradition. The mistress oversaw preparations, dressing the children in their finest clothes, little frocks of cotton trimmed with lace, polished shoes, and neatly brushed hair. They were excited, as children often are on holy days, their voices bubbling with chatter about candy, hymns, and festivities that would follow. They had no reason to suspect that this morning, unlike all the others, would end in silence. The laundress, too, was awake before the sun. She had ironed the family's garments days before, preparing for this moment when appearances mattered most. She moved quietly, her hands steady, her face unreadable. To anyone watching, she was as dutiful as ever, ensuring that nothing interrupted the family celebration. But inside her, something had shifted. The songs of resurrection that filled the air reminded her not of hope, but of loss. The very word Easter pressed against her mind like a weight resurrection for others, never for her Dot. As the family prepared to leave for church, the children, dressed and restless, drifted toward the laundress. It was nothing unusual. They trusted her. They had followed her countless times before, clinging to her skirts as she carried baskets, asking questions in the innocent, unknowing way that only children can. They saw her not as a servant, but as a constant figure always present, always near. She looked at them that morning with a gaze no one noticed. Perhaps her lips curved into the faintest smile, one that hid the storm gathering inside her. Or perhaps her face was set, her jaw tight with resolve. The truth of her expression is lost to history, but what we know is this: when the bells rang for church, she did not join the others on the path to the chapel. Instead, she turned toward the water. Dot. It was a familiar walk. The laundress had taken it hundreds of times before, baskets of linens balanced on her head or gripped in her arms. The children had gone with her before as well, splashing their feet at the riverbank, laughing at the ripple of minnows darting through the reeds. To anyone who might have seen them that morning, it would have looked ordinary, a woman and children on their way to the wash. Nothing suspicious, nothing threatening, but the laundress knew differently. This was no ordinary morning. With each step, the sound of the bells seemed to grow fainter, replaced by the rush of the river. The path was lined with new blossoms, the world alive with spring. Yet the air around her seemed heavy, as though even nature anticipated what was to come. The children walked alongside her, perhaps laughing, perhaps skipping stones as they drew near the bank. Their small voices carried joy, untainted by fear. They could not know that their trust was about to be betrayed. They could not know that the hands that once washed their clothes would soon hold them beneath the water. For the laundress, each step may have felt like surrender. Years of labor, grief, and spiritual torment had led to this moment. The water ahead shimmered in the morning sun, innocent and inviting, but to her it was something else. It was the Jordan, the cleansing flood, the end of her suffering and the children's innocence alike. Dot, by the time they reached the water's edge, the bells had faded into the distance, and the Easter morning hymns were nothing more than echoes. There was only the laundress, the children, and the river that waited to receive them. The river that morning looked deceptively calm. Sunlight shimmered across its surface, turning ripples into scattered diamonds. The children skipped along the bank, bending to touch the water, their laughter breaking the stillness. To them, it was a game, a ritual of joy on Easter morning. To the laundress, it was the threshold she had long imagined, the place where her thoughts and burdens converged. She stood still for a moment, basket in hand, as though preparing for her usual work. Anyone watching would have seen nothing more than a laundress beginning her daily task. Yet inside, her chest tightened. This was not laundry. This was absolution. This was release. One by one, the children followed her closer to the water. They trusted her hands that had washed their night clothes, soothed their cuts, guided their steps across slippery banks. Their trust was her power. Some accounts suggest she may have framed her act as a ritual. Perhaps she spoke softly, telling them they would play a game, or that she would help them wash clean before the Easter feast. Perhaps she quoted fragments of scripture she had overheard, words about cleansing sins in the water, about baptism and rebirth. The children, too young to understand the weight of her words, may have nodded, believing her entirely. Then came the moment when her resolve hardened. Maybe she lifted the smallest child first, holding them in her arms as though to rock them. Perhaps she whispered a lullaby as she stepped into the water, her skirts darkening with the flood. And then, with a strength forged from years of labor, She pressed the child beneath the surface. The river swallowed the cries. The children on the bank may have thought it a game at first, splashing, dunking. But when the first did not rise, their laughter faltered. The laundress turned back, her face unreadable, and reached for another dot in those moments. The water became a boundary between two worlds. Innocence above, silence below. Each child who entered never returned to the surface alive. The laundress's arms, once instruments of care, became instruments of destruction. The river bore witness without judgment. Its current carried away bubbles, ripples, and then nothing at all. Only stillness remained, disturbed only by her labored breathing and the soft rustle of reeds in the wind. Some say she did not stop until every child was gone. Their small forms surrendered to the deep. Others suggest she paused, trembling, as though caught between guilt and grim conviction. But in the end, the result was the same: silence. The Easter bells, faint in the distance, clashed with the absence of children's voices by the river. When it was done, the laundress stood alone in the shallows. Her skirts clung heavy to her legs. Her arms quivered with exhaustion. Before her, the water stilled once more, as though nothing had happened. The children's clothing, still bright from their Easter dressing, drifted just beneath the surface before sinking out of sight. What did she feel in that moment? No record survives. Did she collapse in grief, realizing the enormity of her act? Did she feel a dark sense of release, believing she had cleansed them of the sins of their fathers? Or was her mind already lost, carried away by the same current that claimed the children? All that we know is this: the Easter morning that had begun with joy now carried an unshakable shadow. By the time the bells finished ringing, the master's children were gone. The laundress had chosen water over silence, action over submission. The plantation would never be the same. The bells had finished ringing when the family noticed the children were gone. At first, there was no panic. Children often wandered chasing butterflies, playing hide and seek, sneaking toward the kitchens for sweets. The mistress assumed they had dawdled with the laundress, as they so often did. She smoothed her dress, readying herself for church, certain they would arrive any moment. But minutes passed. Then more. No laughter. No footsteps pounding across the porch. Only silence. The unease grew quickly. Servants were sent to search. Voices began to call across the yard, echoing through the rows of cabins, into the orchard, down the path to the river. Where are the children? Have you seen them? Did they follow the laundress? The mistress's voice trembled as her questions sharpened into cries. The master, red with fury and fear, ordered the search widened. Churchgoers, hearing the shouts, began to trickle back toward the house, abandoning pews for panic. The joyous Easter gathering unraveled as whispers spread. The master's children are missing. It was by the river that the truth revealed itself. Someone, maybe a field hand, maybe one of the searchers first, saw a fragment of fabric drifting against the reeds. It was pale, almost glowing against the dark water. A child's sleeve. Then another. Then a small shoe, caught in the mud. The cries went up at once. Men waded in, their boots sinking, their hands clawing through the current. One by one, limp bodies surfaced, pulled from the shallows, laid upon the grass. The bright Easter clothes clung to their small frames, heavy with water, their faces pale and still. The scene was unspeakable. The mistress collapsed at the sight, her screams piercing through the crowd. The master raged, cursing, demanding answers, demanding blood. Even the hardened overseers stood speechless, shaken by the enormity of what they saw. Easter had turned from celebration to nightmare in a single hour. And then came the question that hung over everyone. Where was the laundress? Some said she stood nearby, soaked to bone, silent, her gaze fixed on nothing at all. Others claimed she had fled, disappearing into the woods, leaving the community to guess at her fate. Still others whispered that she remained by the river unrepentant. As though waiting for judgment to come, the enslaved community trembled. To them, this act was almost unimaginable. They knew suffering, they knew loss, but to turn on children, innocent of their parents' sins, was something else entirely. Some whispered she must have been possessed. Others, in hushed voices, wondered if she had simply broken under the unbearable weight of her life. The Easter gathering dissolved into chaos. Mothers clutched their own children tightly, fathers raised fists to heaven, and preachers struggled to find words that could soothe such sudden grief. There were none. The river, once a place of work and sustenance, now carried the memory of death. By nightfall, the story had already begun to spread. Riders carried the tale from plantation to plantation, from town to town. The laundress drowned the master's children on Easter Sunday. The words carried horror, disbelief, and a chill that would linger for generations. The discovery had shattered not only one family, but the fragile illusion of order upon which the entire community rested. If even the caretakers of children could rebel, if even they could turn tenderness into destruction, then no one was safe. The news spread of what had happened by the river. The response was swift, brutal, and unrelenting. In a society built on control, there could be no tolerance for defiance, especially not one that struck at the very heart of white families, their children. The laundress, whether she was seized immediately at the scene or captured after a short flight, was dragged back in chains to face judgment. There would be no fair trial, no deliberation, no voice raised in her defense. Her fate had already been decided the moment the drowned children were pulled from the water. For the master and his household, the laundress was not a woman who had suffered, not a soul tormented by years of bondage. She was a monster, the embodiment of evil, and she would be treated as such. The official proceedings, if they could even be called that, were little more than ritual. She may have been brought before a magistrate, her crime announced to a crowd already baying for vengeance. Witnesses might have testified, though the drowned children spoke louder than any words. The laundress, some said, stood silent. Others claimed she muttered prayers or fragments of hymns. Still others swore she smiled, as though she had found some terrible release. Punishment was inevitable. In the mid-1800s South, enslaved people who defied the order of things faced whipping, branding, mutilation, or hanging. For an act of this magnitude, drowning the master's children, death was certain, and it would be made an example. Her execution was not just retribution. It was a warning. To the enslaved community, do not even think of rebellion. To the white community, see, justice will always be done. But beneath the spectacle of judgment, unease festered. This was not a theft of goods, not an escape attempt, not even a violent confrontation with an overseer. This was something deeper, stranger, harder to explain. Why would a woman who had cared for those very children suddenly turn upon them? Why had she chosen Easter Sunday, the holiest day, to carry out her act? The answers varied, each more unsettling than the last. To some, she was branded insane. Madness, they said, had consumed her, a madness born of toil, grief, and the weight of slavery. To others, she was possessed by dark spirits, her act seen as a kind of blasphemy against the holy day. Still others whispered in hushed tones that it was deliberate rebellion, a strike at the master's heart, revenge for years of exploitation, a message written not in words but in water. Among the enslaved, fear mingled with something more complicated. Many recoiled in horror, unable to fathom how she could harm children. Yet a few, in secret corners, may have wondered if she had simply broken free in the only way she could, by destroying what the master valued most. It was a thought too dangerous to speak aloud, but it lingered nonetheless. In the days that followed, the plantation was draped in mourning. The mistress withdrew, undone by grief. The master prowled like a wounded beast, his rage barely contained. The community held hushed services, their prayers filled with words of confusion, anger, and dread. Easter, meant to symbolize life and renewal, had been transformed into a symbol of death and desecration. The laundress's name was erased, as though denying her identity could erase her deed. Yet the story remained. It could not be buried with her body, nor drowned in the river. Instead, it spread outward, retold in whispers, reshaped in sermons, etched into the fearful imagination of all who heard it. Her judgment had been swift, but her legacy was only beginning. The laundress's life ended swiftly, but her act did not. Death silenced her voice, yet the story she left behind traveled far beyond the plantation gates. In the decades that followed, her name faded, erased deliberately by those who wished to bury the shame. But the tale itself refused to die. It clung to memory like the scent of smoke after a fire. Whispers carried it through the cabins of the enslaved and the parlors of the free. For some, it became a cautionary tale, proof of the madness that bondage could create. Preachers spoke of it in hushed tones, warning their flocks of the dangers of sin, of the devil's influence on weak minds. They painted the laundress as a creature consumed by evil, a Judas who had betrayed even the innocent. But among the enslaved, the story took on a different weight. Not often spoken aloud, never in the presence of whites, it existed in fragments, in glances, in murmured words over campfires. For some, it was a horror they could not accept, an act too cruel to justify. For others, it was something darker still, a forbidden kind of resistance. By drowning the children, the laundress had struck at the very heart of her oppressors. She had taken from the master what could never be replaced. It was vengeance terrible, unforgivable, but vengeance nonetheless. Folklore bent the tale into many forms. Some said the laundress had been driven insane by grief after her own children were sold away. Others claimed she believed she was baptizing the master's children, washing their souls clean in the only way she understood. Still others swore she had been guided by a spirit, a whisper from the river itself, urging her to act. Each retelling changed her motive, but the core remained. Easter Sunday, the river, the drowned children. The land itself seemed to remember. Families told stories of the river, running colder where the children died, of strange silences that fell upon its banks, of shadows that lingered in the water at dusk. Mothers warned their children not to wander too close, lest the laundress's spirit reach out and pull them under. Her act had blurred the line between history and haunting, turning a moment of violence into a legend that echoed for generations. And yet, the story also became a mirror. To some, it revealed the cruelty of slavery, the way it crushed human souls until nothing remained but despair and rage. To others, it exposed the fragility of the master's world, how even those entrusted to nurture and protect could no longer be contained. In this way, the laundress's act became more than murder. It was a symbol, however twisted, of a system that was rotting from within. Today, her story remains largely forgotten, tucked away in fragments of oral history and scattered records. But when we unearth it, we confront uncomfortable questions. What drove her to that river? Was it madness? Was it faith? Was it rebellion? Or was it something that defies explanation altogether? What we do know is this: Easter Sunday was meant to be a day of joy, a day of resurrection, a day when death was conquered by life. Yet for one plantation family, it became a day of loss so profound it could never be erased. And for one laundress, it became the moment she chose to answer suffering with an act that silenced innocence itself. The echoes of that act still linger, carried not just in folklore, but in the questions it leaves us with. Questions about desperation, about justice, about the breaking point of the human spirit. Questions we may never be able to answer fully, On that Easter morning, church bells rang in triumph, declaring that Christ had risen. But by the river, the only sound was silence. The Master's children were gone, and the laundress had etched her story into history, not with words, but with water dot, and so the tale endures, unsettling, unforgettable. A shadow on a holy day.